At its peak, Venice controlled 3,000 merchant ships, 30,000 sailors, and the trade routes that moved 80% of Europe's luxury goods. Yet the entire city was built on millions of wooden logs driven into mud. No other civilization in history built so much wealth on such impossible foundations. How did they do it? The answer lies in innovations we still use today. The assembly line, the patent system, standardized shipping containers, even the concept of quarantine. Join me as we explore how Venice turned geographic disaster into economic miracle. In the 5th century, the mighty Western Roman Empire lay dying. For over 800 years, Rome had dominated the Mediterranean world, its legions conquering from Britain to Mesopotamia. But by 410, the unthinkable happened. Visigothic warriors sacked Rome itself, the first time in 8 centuries that foreign invaders had breached the eternal city's walls. The collapse accelerated. Wave after wave of barbarian tribes swept across northern Italy. Attila the Hun led his feared horsemen through the prosperous cities of the Po Valley in 445 and 452, leaving devastation in their wake. Cities that had stood for centuries burned. Trade routes collapsed. The sophisticated Roman infrastructure crumbled. And the people? They fled for their lives. But where could they go? The barbarians controlled the roads. The mountains offered little sanctuary, so thousands of desperate refugees turned to a place nobody wanted, a place that seemed to offer nothing but suffering and death, the marshy lagoons of the northern Adriatic coast. These were not pleasant wetlands. Imagine standing at the edge of this watery wasteland. Before you stretch miles of shallow, brackish water, neither fully sea nor fully land. Islands of mud barely rise above the tide. Thick morning fogs obscure everything. The air reeks of salt and decay. Mosquitoes swarm in dark clouds. Fresh water must be collected from rare springs or carried in from the mainland. Solid ground exists only in scattered patches of sand and silt. Yet these marshes held one critical advantage. They were utterly defensible. Barbarian cavalry, so devastating on open plains, floundered helplessly in the maze of channels and tidal flats. Only those who knew the secret paths through the shallows could navigate safely. At high tide, many routes vanished completely beneath murky water. At low tide, boats grounded on hidden mudbanks. The first refugees arrived as early as 402, fleeing Gothic raids. They perched on whatever dry ground they could find, living in crude huts of reeds and mud. More came after Attila's invasions. Small communities formed on the more substantial islands: Torcello, Malamaco, Chioggia. These were not settlers seeking fortune. These were survivors clinging to life. They learned, through brutal necessity, to adapt. They drove wooden pilings deep into the mud to create stable foundations. They harvested salt from evaporating tidal pools. They fished the lagoon's waters and collected shellfish. They traded these basic goods with the mainland for grain and materials they could not produce themselves. The settlements remained small, scattered, unimportant. No one imagined these desperate marsh dwellers would build anything of consequence. Who could foresee that from these humble, waterlogged beginnings would emerge a maritime empire that would dominate Mediterranean commerce for 1,000 years? Yet even in these dark centuries, as classical civilization crumbled, the future was taking root in the mud. The refugees had survived by hiding in the marshes. But to truly live, to build something permanent, they needed to solve an impossible problem. How do you construct a city where there is no solid ground? The solution was as audacious as it was labor-intensive. Venice would be built on wood. Hundreds of thousands, eventually millions, of wooden pilings would be driven deep through the soft mud and silt until they reached the harder clay layer below, sometimes 12 to 15 feet down. Upon these pilings, the city would rise. But where would such vast quantities of timber come from? The lagoon islands themselves offered little. The refugees looked north to the great alpine forests that stretched across the mountains separating Italy from the rest of Europe. Oak and larch grew in abundance there, their wood dense and durable. The early Venetians established connections with mainland communities who could supply these precious logs. The timber arrived by river, floated down from the mountains during spring floods when water levels ran high. Workers then faced the backbreaking task of positioning each log vertically and driving it into the lagoon bed. Teams of men wielded massive wooden mallets, striking synchronized blows hour after hour. A single foundation might require hundreds of pilings, packed together so tightly you could barely slip a knife blade between them. The wood, constantly submerged in the oxygen-poor lagoon water, would not rot. Instead, over decades and centuries, minerals in the water gradually petrified the timber, turning it harder than stone. The refugees were unknowingly creating foundations that would last 1,000 years. Once pilings were in place, workers laid horizontal planks across the tops, creating a wooden platform. Above this, they set stone foundations using Istrian limestone carried by boat from quarries across the Adriatic. This dense white stone resisted the corrosive salt water better than any other material available. Only then could actual buildings begin to rise. The city took shape not as a planned metropolis, but as an organic network of communities spreading across the lagoon. Between the islands, natural channels served as streets. But these needed widening, deepening, dredging. Workers in flat-bottomed boats scooped mud from the shallows, creating navigable waterways. The excavated silt was used to raise the level of building sites, providing precious inches of elevation above the tides. Everything had to be imported. Every brick, every piece of timber, every stone arrived by boat. Nothing could be grown or quarried locally. This simple reality shaped Venetian character from the beginning. They had to trade to survive. The marshes offered fish, salt, and nothing else. By the 7th and 8th centuries, distinct communities had established themselves on the major islands. Wooden bridges began connecting the settlements. Churches rose on their pilings, modest at first, but growing more ambitious. The technology improved with each generation. Builders learned which types of timber lasted longest, which configurations of pilings provided the strongest support, how to channel water flow to prevent erosion. Venice was not built in a day, nor a decade, nor a century. It grew slowly, organically, each generation adding to what their ancestors had created. They were building something unprecedented, a city that floated between sea and land, between past and future, anchored only by human determination and wooden posts driven deep into the mud. But construction was only the beginning. To truly prosper, these lagoon dwellers would need to look beyond their watery maze out to the vast Mediterranean beyond. By the late 7th century, the scattered island communities of the lagoon faced a critical question: who would lead them? Each settlement had its own local leaders, its own interests, its own petty disputes with neighbors. Byzantine officials across the Adriatic and Ravenna claimed nominal authority, but their grip on these remote marshes was tenuous at best. The lagoon dwellers needed a leader of their own. In the year 697, representatives from across the islands gathered for an unprecedented assembly. They would elect a doge, from the Venetian dialect for ducks, the Latin word for leader. The man they chose, according to tradition, was Pauluccio Anafesto, though historians debate whether he truly existed or is a later invention to give Venice a more ancient pedigree than it deserves. What matters is not the man, but the principle. Venice would be led by an elected official, not a hereditary monarch. This was revolutionary in an age when kings ruled by divine right and power passed from father to son. The doge would wield considerable authority, but he served at the pleasure of the nobles who elected him. The early system was chaotic. Byzantine influence remained strong, and the empire in Constantinople watched Venice carefully, viewing these lagoon communities as wayward subjects who needed guidance. The first doges borrowed heavily from Byzantine ceremony and titles. They wore purple robes like Eastern emperors and presided over courts thick with Greek ritual and protocol. But beneath the borrowed pageantry, something distinctly Venetian was emerging. The great families who controlled trade and owned the largest properties fought viciously for power. Some doges tried to make the position hereditary, appointing their sons as co-rulers. Others were deposed, blinded, or murdered by rivals. The 8th century saw doge after doge rise and fall, each backed by a different faction of nobles. These power struggles forced evolution in the system. If one family could not be allowed to dominate permanently, then power must be shared, diffused, balanced. Gradually, assemblies became regularized. The Great Council emerged, comprising the noble families who had the wealth and status to claim political voice. They met to advise the doge to check his ambitions to ensure no single leader could accumulate too much authority. The Byzantine Empire inadvertently accelerated Venetian independence. As Constantinople faced invasion from the east and internal turmoil, its grip on distant territories weakened. Venice paid lip service to Byzantine overlordship while quietly conducting its own affairs. The doges stopped looking to Ravenna or Constantinople for approval. By the 9th century, assembly traditions had become entrenched. Major decisions required consultation with the nobles. The doge could not declare war, negotiate treaties, or impose taxes without consent. This was not democracy as we understand it today, far from it. Only a tiny fraction of the population, the established noble families, held any voice. But within that elite circle, power was distributed in ways that had no parallel in medieval Europe. Why did this matter? Because this system of shared governance, of checks and balances, of collective decision-making among the wealthy, would prove remarkably stable and adaptable. While kingdoms around them collapsed in succession crises and civil wars, Venice would maintain political continuity for centuries. The Republic had been born, not from grand philosophical principles, but from practical necessity and bitter experience. The lagoon dwellers had learned that survival required cooperation, that unchecked ambition led to chaos. But establishing a government was only the beginning. To maintain their independence and prosperity, Venice would need to look outward to the profitable and dangerous trade routes of the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries needed allies it could trust. Constantinople controlled the richest cities in Christendom, commanded fleets that patrolled the Mediterranean, and presided over trade networks stretching from the Black Sea to the Adriatic. Yet enemies pressed from every direction. Arab raiders struck coastal settlements. Slavic tribes pushed into the Balkans. The empire needed intermediaries, merchants who could move goods through dangerous waters, and Venice was perfectly positioned. In 829, Emperor Michael II granted Venice its first major trading privilege. Venetian merchants could enter Byzantine ports at reduced tariffs, a gift that transformed the lagoon economy overnight. Why would Constantinople offer such generosity? Because Venice provided services no one else could. Venetian ships transported Byzantine silks and spices northward into Europe. They carried Frankish wool and timber back to Eastern markets. They operated in the gray zones between empires, neither fully Eastern nor Western, accepted by both. The relationship was never simple friendship. Venice owed nominal allegiance to Constantinople, acknowledging Byzantine suzerainty in official documents and ceremonies. Doges continued borrowing imperial symbols and titles. But actual control? That was another matter entirely. Venice paid no taxes to Constantinople. It maintained its own fleet, conducted its own diplomacy, and increasingly ignored Byzantine directives that conflicted with commercial interests. This ambiguity proved invaluable when Charlemagne and his successors tried expanding into northern Italy. The Carolingian Empire controlled vast territories, from modern France through Germany into Italy. They viewed the wealthy lagoon cities with covetous eyes. But attacking Venice meant confronting a Byzantine protectorate, risking war with Constantinople. The empire's distant shadow provided protection that the lagoon's marshes alone could not guarantee. Venice exploited this shield brilliantly. When Frankish armies marched south, Venetian diplomats reminded them of Byzantine treaties. When Constantinople demanded greater submission, Venice pointed to Carolingian threats, arguing it needed autonomy to navigate between hostile powers. The Lagoon Republic played both empires against each other, maintaining independence through careful balance. Meanwhile, Venetian merchants built fortunes on salt. The lagoon's shallow waters and intense summer sun created ideal conditions for salt production. Workers flooded marshland plots, let seawater evaporate, then harvested the crystallized residue. This white gold was essential for preserving meat and fish in an age without refrigeration. Northern European markets paid premium prices, and Venice controlled production throughout the northern Adriatic. Salt revenues funded fleet expansion. More ships meant protection for merchant vessels and capacity to transport larger cargoes. Venice began carrying not just its own salt, but goods from distant ports. Byzantine silks, Egyptian spices, Syrian glassware, all passed through Venetian warehouses. The city transformed from regional salt producer to international trading hub. By the year 1000, Venice had achieved something remarkable. It remained officially part of the Byzantine sphere while functioning as an independent commercial power. The empire in Constantinople provided protection and trading access. Venice provided loyalty when convenient and services the empire valued. Both sides benefited from the arrangement, though neither fully trusted the other. This calculated ambiguity would define Venetian foreign policy for centuries to come. In 828, two Venetian merchants stood in Alexandria facing an impossible choice. Buono de Malamocco and Rustico de Torcello had sailed to Egypt on routine business, trading European timber for Eastern spices. But Alexandria was changing. Muslim authorities had begun enforcing stricter regulations on Christian sites, and rumors spread that churches might be demolished, their contents destroyed or dispersed. Inside the Church of St. Mark, where tradition held the evangelist's body had rested for nearly 8 centuries, monks watched helplessly as their world grew more uncertain. The Venetians saw opportunity where others saw crisis. Venice lacked what Constantinople, Rome, and other great Christian cities possessed: a prestigious patron saint. The city venerated Saint Theodore, a Byzantine military martyr, but Theodore was Constantinople's gift, a reminder of dependence. What if Venice could claim an apostle's remains? What if they possessed relics rivaling Rome itself? The merchants approached the church monks with a proposition that was equal parts pilgrimage and theft. They would save St. Mark's body from potential desecration by transporting it to Venice, where it would receive proper veneration. The monks hesitated, torn between protecting the relics and betraying their sacred trust. But the Venetians pressed their case. Was it not better for the saint to rest safely in Christian Venice than risk destruction under increasingly hostile authorities? Agreement reached, the real challenge began. How do you smuggle a saint past Muslim port inspectors? The merchants demonstrated the cunning that would define Venetian commercial success. They concealed Mark's bones beneath layers of pickled pork in large barrels. Muslim officials, forbidden by religious law from touching swine, waved the cargo through without inspection. Saint departed Alexandria hidden under the one substance his captors would never examine closely. The voyage home was treacherous. Spring storms battered the ship. According to accounts that quickly became legend, the saint himself appeared to the terrified sailors, calming the waters and guiding them safely to Venice. Whether divine intervention or skilled navigation, the vessel reached the lagoon intact. Doge Giustiniano Participatio received the relics as a revelation. Here was Venice's divine mandate, proof that God favored the lagoon republic. The theft became a sacred rescue. The smuggling became a miracle. Construction began immediately on a basilica worthy of the saint, built adjacent to the ducal palace at the heart of Venetian power. The first St. Mark's Basilica rose quickly, a statement of ambition and independence. Venice now possessed an apostle's bones, a spiritual authority that transcended Byzantine permissions or Roman approval. The winged lion, St. Mark's symbol, began appearing on Venetian flags, coins, and official seals. The city had found its identity. This was more than religious devotion. By claiming Mark, Venice claimed legitimacy that required no emperor's blessing. The Byzantines might grant trading privileges, but Venice owed its spiritual authority directly to God through his evangelist. Rome might claim primacy through Peter, but Venice held Mark, who had founded the church in Alexandria and whose gospel stood equally in Scripture. The transformation was immediate and profound. Pax tibi Mars, Evangelista Meos, became the city's motto, "Peace to you, Mark, my evangelist." not our evangelist. My evangelist. Venice spoke as a singular entity, unified under its patron saint. The audacious theft from Alexandria established a pattern that would repeat throughout Venetian history. When opportunity appeared, Venice would seize it, transform it, and claim divine sanction. The merchants who stole a saint's body had given Venice something more valuable than gold, a story of destiny that would sustain the Republic through centuries of struggle. With St. Mark's bones securing divine legitimacy, Venice turned its attention to earthly dominance. The Adriatic Sea stretched before the lagoon like a highway, and Venice intended to control every vessel that sailed it. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Adriatic was anything but safe. Pirates made fortune and survival equally uncertain for merchants brave enough to venture beyond sight of land. The Narentines were the worst of them. Slavic raiders operating from the Dalmatian coast, they had transformed piracy into a sophisticated industry. Their swift galleys darted from hidden coves, overwhelming merchant vessels before help could arrive. They demanded tribute from passing ships, and those who refused to pay found their cargo seized and their crews thrown overboard. For decades, they had operated with impunity, their scattered island bases making retaliation nearly impossible. Venice had tolerated the pirates while building strength. But by the late 10th century, the Republic possessed both the naval power and the commercial ambition to act. Doge Pietro Orseolo II launched a systematic campaign to eliminate the Narentine threat. In the year 1000, Venetian war galleys swept down the Dalmatian coast like a cleansing tide. The pirates, accustomed to raiding unarmed merchants, found themselves facing a professional fleet manned by sailors who knew these waters as intimately as they did. The campaign was brutally efficient. Venice burned pirate bases, destroyed their ships, and offered coastal towns a simple choice: submit to Venetian protection or face the same fate as the raiders. Most chose submission. Within 2 years, Orseolo had transformed the Dalmatian coast from a pirate haven into a Venetian protectorate. But Venice understood that military conquest meant nothing without economic integration. The Republic established trading posts in newly conquered ports. Venetian merchants received preferential treatment. Local shipbuilders were commissioned to construct vessels for the Venetian fleet. The Dalmatian coast became not merely subject territory, but an extension of Venice itself, a chain of maritime bases securing the eastern Adriatic. With pirates eliminated and rival ports subdued, Venice proclaimed something audacious. The Adriatic was no longer international waters. It was the Golfo da Venezia, the Gulf of Venice. This was not mere rhetoric. Venice enforced its claim with naval patrols, demanding that foreign vessels request permission before entering Adriatic waters. The sea itself had become Venetian property. To celebrate this dominance, Venice created a ceremony that would endure for 8 centuries. Each year on Ascension Day, the Doge sailed out to the Lido aboard the Bucentaur, the state's magnificent ceremonial galley. There, in full view of the assembled nobility and foreign ambassadors, he cast a golden ring into the waves. "We wed thee, O sea, in token of perpetual domination," the Doge proclaimed. Venice had married the Adriatic, and like any marriage in medieval Europe, this union meant possession. The ceremony was brilliant propaganda. It announced to every maritime power that Venice considered the Adriatic its exclusive domain. It reminded Venetian citizens that their republic's power rested on naval supremacy. And it transformed commercial dominance into sacred ritual, suggesting that God himself sanctioned Venetian control of these waters. By the early 11th century, no ship crossed the Adriatic without Venetian approval. Every cargo that moved between east and west passed through waters Venice claimed as its own. The Republic had achieved what Rome never managed: complete mastery of the Adriatic Sea. But mastery of one sea was merely the beginning. Venice's ambitions reached far beyond the gulf it had claimed as dowry. Dominance required not just skilled sailors but ships, and by the early 12th century, Venice faced a fundamental problem. The Republic's expanding trade network and military commitments demanded an ever-growing fleet, yet traditional shipbuilding methods could not keep pace with the need. A merchant galley might take 6 months to construct. A warship could require a year. Venice's enemies could build ships too. What the Republic needed was something unprecedented: the ability to produce vessels faster than any rival could match. In 1104, the Venetian state authorized construction of the Arsenal, a massive shipbuilding complex on the eastern edge of the city. The name derived from the Arabic Dar al-Sinaya, meaning house of industry, a term Venetian merchants had encountered in Islamic shipyards. But what Venice built would dwarf anything in the Mediterranean world. The Arsenal began as a fortified basin where galleys could be constructed away from prying foreign eyes. Within decades, it had expanded into something far more ambitious: a fully integrated industrial complex covering 60 acres of land and water. Rope walks stretched for hundreds of meters, where workers twisted fibers into cables strong enough to hold a galley against storm winds. Foundries cast bronze cannons and iron fittings. Warehouses stored pre-cut timbers measured and marked for specific positions in standard galley designs. Sail lofts employed hundreds of seamstresses cutting canvas to precise specifications. But the true innovation was not size. It was method. Venice had invented the assembly line 300 years before Henry Ford was born. Traditional shipbuilding required craftsmen to construct each vessel individually from keel to mast. The Arsenal broke this process into standardized stages. A galley hull moved through the complex on a precisely planned route, stopping at specialized stations where teams of workers added specific components. At one station, workers installed ribs according to standard measurements. At the next, planking crews fastened hull plates using pre-drilled timbers. Further along, riggers installed masts and cordage. The final station equipped the vessel with arms, provisions, and crew. The system required something revolutionary: interchangeable parts. Every galley followed identical specifications. A rudder built for one vessel fit perfectly on another. Oars were cut to standard lengths. Even hull timbers were pre-shaped to patterns, allowing rapid replacement of damaged components. If a galley limped home with battle damage, the Arsenal could restore it to combat readiness in days using standardized replacement parts pulled from warehouse stocks. The workforce numbered 16,000 men at peak capacity. These arsenalati formed a privileged class within Venetian society. Their skills were state secrets. Leaving Venice to work for foreign powers meant death. In return, they received guaranteed wages, superior housing, and pensions for widows. They wore distinctive clothing marking their elite status. During state ceremonies, arsenalati marched as honored guards, their presence reminding spectators where Venice's true power was forged. The arsenal's output was staggering. Contemporary observers claimed the complex could produce a fully equipped galley in a single day. When King Henry III of France visited Venice in 1574, the arsenal demonstrated this capability during a banquet. As the king dined, workers assembled a complete galley from keel to fighting castle. By the time Henry finished his final course, a seaworthy vessel floated in the basin, fully armed and provisioned. Whether this represented typical production speed or theatrical showmanship hardly mattered. The demonstration sent an unmistakable message. Venice possessed industrial capacity no rival could match. While Genoa or Barcelona might build 10 ships, Venice built 50. While other cities scraped together emergency fleets, the arsenal maintained a reserve force ready for immediate deployment. This manufacturing supremacy transformed naval warfare in the Mediterranean. Venice could afford to lose ships in battle knowing replacements were already taking shape in the arsenal's basins. Enemy commanders fought cautiously, unable to replace losses quickly. Venetian admirals attacked aggressively, backed by an industrial machine that treated warships as renewable resources. The arsenal became more than a shipyard. It was the beating heart of Venetian power, the factory where maritime dominance was literally manufactured. And that dominance would soon be tested in the most ambitious military campaign Venice had ever attempted. The Crusades presented Venice with an opportunity disguised as holy war. When Pope Urban II called for Christian armies to reclaim Jerusalem in 1095, other Italian cities saw spiritual obligation. Venice saw profit margins. The First Crusade succeeded without Venetian involvement, establishing 4 Crusader states along the Levantine coast by 1100. But these nascent kingdoms faced a logistics nightmare. European knights could conquer territory, but they could not supply it. Grain, weapons, reinforcements, everything had to cross the Mediterranean. The Crusader states needed ships. Venice had them. Doge Vitali Michiel negotiated the first transport contract in 1101. Venetian galleys would ferry Crusader armies to the Holy Land. In exchange, Venice demanded payment in gold, trading rights in conquered cities, and permanent quarters where Venetian merchants could operate under their own laws. The Crusaders, desperate for naval support, agreed. The arrangement proved extraordinarily lucrative. A single transport fleet might carry 2,000 knights plus horses, squires, and equipment. Venice charged premium rates for military transport during wartime. But the real prize came after the battles ended. Those trading privileges transformed every conquered port into a Venetian outpost. In 1124, Venetian galleys supported the Crusader siege of Tyre. When the city fell, Venice claimed 1/3 of Tyre itself, plus exemption from all customs duties throughout the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Venetian merchants could now buy Syrian silk and Egyptian spices directly from source markets, shipping goods to Europe without paying Byzantine or Islamic middlemen. The profit margins were extraordinary. Similar quarters appeared in Acre, Sidon, and every major Crusader port. These enclaves functioned as sovereign Venetian territory on foreign soil. The settlements had their own courts applying Venetian law, their own churches, their own warehouses and docks. A Venetian merchant in Acre lived under the same legal protections he enjoyed in the Rialto. The Crusader kings accepted this arrangement because Venice's fleet was irreplaceable. Without Venetian ships, the Crusader states would starve. But Venice was not alone in recognizing this opportunity. Genoa and Pisa dispatched their own fleets, negotiating similar privileges. The three Italian republics competed viciously for trading concessions, sometimes fighting each other even while nominally supporting the same Crusader cause. In Acre, separate Venetian and Genoese quarters faced each other across hostile streets. Merchants from the rival cities brawled in markets. Their fleets occasionally clashed in sight of Crusader ports. The competition grew particularly fierce over access to Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire remained the gateway to Asian trade routes. Whoever controlled shipping through the Bosphorus controlled the flow of silk, spices, and precious metals entering Europe. Venice had cultivated Byzantine relationships for centuries, but Genoa was gaining ground. Emperor Manuel I granted Genoese merchants trading privileges matching Venice's ancient concessions. The Republic's monopoly was fracturing. Venice needed a dramatic move to restore its dominant position. The opportunity came with the Fourth Crusade, called by Pope Innocent III in 1198. The expedition aimed to reclaim Jerusalem through an invasion of Egypt. The Crusader army needed transport. They turned to Venice. Doge Enrico Dandolo, 80 years old and nearly blind, negotiated an audacious contract. Venice would build a fleet capable of carrying 33,500 men plus horses and provisions. The price, 85,000 silver marks, more than twice the annual revenue of England. The Crusaders agreed. They had no choice. Only Venice possessed the industrial capacity to build such a fleet. But when the Crusaders arrived in Venice in 1202, they could not pay. The Crusaders gathered in Venice in the summer of 1202, a ragged army with empty purses. They had promised 85,000 silver marks. They delivered barely half that amount. Enrico Dandolo faced a dilemma. His shipyards had spent 2 years building the largest fleet Venice had ever assembled. 450 ships sat ready in the lagoon. The city had mobilized its entire economy for this contract, suspending normal trade to focus on crusade transport. Venice needed payment. The old doge, blind yet formidable, proposed an alternative. Venice would defer the debt if the Crusaders performed a service. The city of Zara, an Adriatic port, had rebelled against Venetian control and placed itself under Hungarian protection. Help Venice recapture Zara, and the fleet would sail. The Crusaders hesitated. Zara was a Christian city. Attacking it would violate the Crusade's sacred purpose. But they had no money and no ships. In November 1202, the combined Venetian and Crusader force besieged Zara. The city surrendered after 2 weeks. Pope Innocent III, furious at this misdirection of his holy war, excommunicated the entire Venetian contingent. Dandolo ignored him. That winter, an unexpected visitor arrived. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, made the Crusaders an extraordinary offer. Help restore his father to Constantinople's throne, and Byzantium would pay 200,000 silver marks, supply provisions for the crusade, and commit 10,000 Byzantine troops to the Jerusalem campaign. The proposal was almost certainly unrealistic, but the debt-ridden Crusaders saw salvation. Dandolo saw something else entirely: an opportunity to eliminate Genoa's Byzantine privileges, to extract unprecedented commercial concessions, to humble the empire that had arrested Venetian merchants 50 years earlier. The fleet arrived at Constantinople in June 1203. The city's massive walls had repelled attackers for 800 years. Its population exceeded 500,000. But the Byzantine military was rotted by corruption and court intrigue. When Crusader forces scaled the walls along the Golden Horn, the reigning emperor fled. Isaac II was restored with his son Alexios IV as co-emperor. The new emperors could not pay. The treasury was depleted. Constantinople's citizens rioted when Alexios attempted to extract the promised gold through taxation. In January 1204, a court coup overthrew Isaac and Alexios. Both were executed. The Crusaders and Venetians found themselves before Constantinople with no Byzantine patron and mounting supply problems. Dandolo proposed the unthinkable. Take Constantinople itself. Divide the Byzantine Empire among the conquerors. On April 12th, 1204, Venetian galleys rammed the seawalls while Crusader siege towers attacked the landward fortifications. The city fell within days. What followed was catastrophic. For 3 days, Crusaders and Venetian sailors plundered Christianity's greatest city. They stripped golden icons from church altars. They melted down ancient artwork for bullion. They smashed priceless relics dating to antiquity. The bronze horses of the hippodrome were torn from their pedestals, shipped to Venice, and mounted on St. Mark's Basilica, where they remain today. The destruction was unprecedented. Constantinople held the accumulated treasures of 1,000 years. Libraries were burned. Artistic masterpieces disappeared forever. The great palace was stripped to its foundations. Niketas Choniates, a Byzantine historian who witnessed the sack, wrote that even the Saracens would have shown more mercy. Venice claimed 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire in the subsequent partition. Crete, the most valuable prize, became Venetian territory. The island's strategic position dominated eastern Mediterranean sea routes. Venice acquired Euboea, key ports in the Peloponnese, and a chain of Aegean islands forming a maritime highway from Venice to the Black Sea. The Venetian quarter in Constantinople expanded to encompass entire districts. Enrico Dandolo died in Constantinople the following year, aged 97. He was buried in Hagia Sophia. His tomb remained visible until the Ottoman conquest. The parchment was explicit. Venice claimed 3/8 of the Roman Empire. But claiming territory and controlling it were entirely different challenges. The Republic now possessed a scattered maritime empire stretching across 1,500 miles of Mediterranean coastline, from the Adriatic to the Aegean to the Black Sea. How does a city-state of perhaps 100,000 people govern an empire? The answer lay in Venice's genius for commercial organization. The same methods that managed merchant convoys and trading contracts would now administer conquered territories. Venice did not seek to occupy land or control populations in the traditional imperial sense. It wanted harbors, fortifications, and the commercial monopolies those positions provided. The Venetian quarter in Constantinople became the model. Under the Partition Treaty, Venice controlled substantial districts along the Golden Horn. These were not merely residential zones for merchants. They were self-governing territories with their own administration, courts, and military garrison. Venetian officials collected customs duties on all trade passing through these ports. Byzantine merchants now paid taxes to Venice for the privilege of trading in their own capital. The system was brilliantly efficient. Venice governed through merchants who were already present for commercial reasons. No separate colonial bureaucracy was necessary. A handful of administrators, backed by rotating naval patrols, maintained Venetian authority. The Republic spent minimal resources on administration while extracting maximum profit. Crete presented a different challenge. The island was enormous, strategically vital, and stubbornly resistant to Venetian control. Venice initially sold Crete to Boniface of Montferrat, the crusade leader, for 1,000 silver marks. When Boniface proved unable to establish control, Venice repurchased the island and committed to direct rule. This decision would require 2 generations and constant military pressure to enforce. Venice divided Crete into districts called sestieri, mirroring Venice's own administrative structure. The Republic encouraged emigration, granting land estates called feudi to Venetian nobles willing to settle the island. These colonial aristocrats formed a ruling class, surrounded by a predominantly Greek population that resented foreign occupation. Candia, Crete's capital, was rebuilt as a fortified Venetian city, complete with arsenals, warehouses, and administrative palaces. The colonization was brutal. Greek landowners were dispossessed. Orthodox churches were subordinated to Catholic authority. Repeated rebellions erupted throughout the 13th century. Venice responded with methodical suppression, rotating military commanders from the metropole to crush resistance. The island's strategic value justified any cost. Across the Aegean, Venice established a chain of fortified trading posts. Modon and Coron, twin harbors on the Peloponnese, became known as the Two Eyes of the Republic. Every Venetian merchant convoy sailing to the Levant stopped at these ports for resupply and naval protection. Venice fortified them massively, maintaining permanent garrisons and shipyards. Negroponte, the Venetian name for Euboea, controlled the strait between mainland Greece and the island. A wooden bridge connected the two shores, and Venice fortified both ends. The position allowed Venice to monitor all maritime traffic through the western Aegean. Smaller islands, Naxos, Paros, Santorini, served as navigation points and emergency harbors along the sea route. In the Black Sea, Venice established factories at Trebizond and along the Crimean coast. These outposts traded for grain, furs, and slaves flowing from the Russian steppes. They existed purely for commerce, maintained by skeleton staffs of merchants who paid local rulers for trading privileges. This was empire as business venture. Venice had no interest in governing populations or spreading civilization. It wanted choke points on trade routes, protected harbors for its convoys, and exclusive commercial privileges. The Republic had transformed military conquest into a maritime monopoly stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. But maintaining this scattered empire required constant naval power. And increasingly, that power faced a determined rival. The conquest of territory meant little without the cargo to fill Venetian hulls. The Fourth Crusade delivered strategic harbors and commercial monopolies, But the real prize was what passed through them: spices, silk, precious dyes. These were the commodities that transformed Venice from wealthy to spectacularly rich. By the mid-13th century, the Republic controlled the most lucrative trade network in European history. Pepper was the foundation. Europeans consumed pepper in quantities that seem extraordinary today. It preserved meat, masked the taste of spoilage, and signaled status at aristocratic tables. A single pound of pepper in London cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages for a skilled craftsman. Yet Europeans craved it desperately enough to pay these extravagant prices. The spice traveled an immense distance. Pepper grew in the Malabar coast of India, was harvested by local merchants, then transported by Arab and Indian traders across the Indian Ocean to ports in the Red Sea or Persian Gulf. From there, Muslim merchants carried it overland to Cairo or Damascus. And at these crucial transshipment points, Venetian merchants waited with ships and silver. Venice built its commercial supremacy on a calculated partnership with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks controlled the Red Sea ports where Asian goods entered the Mediterranean world. They also ruled Syria, commanding the overland routes from Baghdad and Persia. This Muslim power and Christian republic found common interest in profit. The relationship scandalized Christian Europe. Popes repeatedly issued bulls forbidding trade with Muslim states, particularly the sale of timber, iron, and weapons that might strengthen Islamic military power. Venice ignored these prohibitions. The Republic paid papal fines when necessary and continued trading. Mamluk sultans granted Venetian merchants preferential customs rates, secure warehouses in Alexandria, and priority access to spice cargoes. In return, Venice provided the Mamluks with European silver, copper, and the very timber and naval supplies the Pope forbade. The profit margins were staggering. Documents from Venetian merchant houses show pepper purchased in Alexandria might cost 12 ducats per 100 pounds. That same shipment sold in Venice for 20 ducats, then perhaps 30 ducats in London or Bruges. A single successful voyage could return 200% profit. One ship, one cargo, could establish a merchant family's fortune for generations. Back in Venice, all this wealth flowed through a single district. The Rialto became the commercial heart not just of Venice, but of European trade itself. Here, merchants gathered beneath open arcades to negotiate contracts, arrange shipping insurance, and extend credit. Money changers established permanent benches, their tables covered with currencies from dozens of kingdoms. The word bank itself derives from these benches, the banca where financial transactions occurred. The Rialto operated on sophisticated commercial instruments that barely existed elsewhere in Europe. Venetian merchants pioneered the bill of exchange, allowing traders to transfer funds across vast distances without moving actual coins. Partnership contracts called colleganza distributed risk between investors and traveling merchants. Maritime insurance policies protected cargo against shipwreck and piracy. These financial innovations were as crucial to Venice's dominance as its warships. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger passed through Venetian warehouses in quantities measured by the ton. Chinese silk arrived in bales. Indian cotton, Persian carpets, and precious gems filled the holds of merchant galleys. Venice did not produce these goods. It simply controlled the routes and markets where they changed hands. The Republic had achieved what no European power managed before or since. It stood as gatekeeper between East and West, collecting profit on everything that passed between civilizations. But monopolies invite competition. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, a new power was watching Venice's wealth with hungry eyes. In 1271, as European merchants squabbled over spice routes in Alexandria and Constantinople, two Venetian brothers embarked on a journey that would reshape geographic understanding itself. Nicola and Marco Polo were not senators or admirals. They were traders, and they had decided to seek markets beyond the familiar Mediterranean world. The Polo brothers had already completed one extraordinary expedition. 6 years earlier, they had traveled east from their trading post in Constantinople, moving through Mongol territories to the court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Khan had received them with fascination, questioned them extensively about European customs and Christian religion, and sent them back with a request for learned men who could teach his court about Western knowledge. When Nicola and Maffeo departed Venice again, they brought Nicola's 17-year-old son. Marco Polo would spend the next 2 decades in Mongol service, and his account of those years would become one of the most influential books of the medieval world. The journey itself took over 3 years. The Polos traveled through Persia, across the Pamir Mountains, through the deserts of Central Asia. Marco described cities of remarkable sophistication, commercial networks linking China to India to the Middle East, technologies and customs Europeans had never imagined. When they finally reached the Khan's summer palace at Chengdu, Marco entered a world of splendor that made even wealthy Venice seem provincial. Kublai Khan employed the young Venetian as a commercial inspector and diplomatic envoy. Marco traveled throughout the Mongol domains, observing administration systems, military organization, and economic infrastructure. He visited provinces of China that no European had seen. He witnessed the Khan's elaborate court ceremonies, the efficiency of the postal relay system, the use of paper money as government currency. What Marco encountered challenged every assumption Europeans held about civilization. Chinese cities dwarfed anything in Europe. Hangzhou, which Marco called Qin's AI, housed over 1 million people with paved streets, canal networks, and organized fire brigades. Markets sold goods in quantities that seemed impossible. The Chinese had invented printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Their ships were larger and more advanced than Venetian vessels. The Polos remained in Khan's service until 1292, when they finally received permission to return home. They arrived in Venice 3 years later, after an absence of 24 years, wearing tattered Mongol clothing and speaking Italian with strange accents. Their own family initially did not recognize them. Marco's homecoming coincided with Venice's naval war against Genoa. In 1298, serving as gentleman commander of a Venetian galley, he was captured after the Battle of Cruzzola and imprisoned in Genoa. In that prison cell, he dictated his experiences to a fellow prisoner named Rustichello da Pisa, a romance writer who shaped Marco's memories into narrative. The resulting book, known as Il Milione, or The Travels of Marco Polo, circulated throughout Europe in multiple languages. Readers encountered descriptions of Japan, Java, India, and Ceylon. Marco described coal, asbestos, and oil used as fuel. He detailed the spice islands of Southeast Asia, explaining exactly where pepper, ginger, and cloves originated. He provided the first systematic European description of Chinese government, Mongol military tactics, and Asian commercial practices. Many contemporaries dismissed the book as fantasy. The numbers seemed too large, the wealth too extravagant, the distances too vast. But merchants recognized valuable intelligence. The book contained specific details about trade routes, market cities, and commercial opportunities. It suggested that the spices Venice purchased in Alexandria originated from sources that might, perhaps, be reached by other routes. Marco Polo's account planted a seed. If an empire this wealthy existed in the East, what fortunes awaited those who could reach it directly? The capture of Marco Polo at Cruzzola was merely one battle in a conflict that had consumed two republics for generations. Venice and Genoa, the Mediterranean's greatest maritime powers, had been circling each other like rival predators since the 1200s. Both cities built their wealth on Eastern trade. Both commanded formidable navies. Both understood that the Mediterranean could not sustain two dominant commercial empires. The fundamental problem was geographical. Genoa controlled access to the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic approaches. Venice dominated the Adriatic and maintained superior relationships with Constantinople. Every major trade route forced merchants to navigate waters controlled by one republic or the other. Cooperation was economically impossible. War was inevitable. The conflict erupted in cycles of violence separated by brief, unstable truces. Genoa's galleys raided Venetian merchant convoys. Venetian fleets attacked Genoese trading posts. Fighting spread from Cyprus to the Black Sea, from Syria to the waters off Constantinople. Each republic sought not merely to defeat the other, but to eliminate its commercial rival entirely. The Battle of Cruzzola in 1298 proved devastating for Venice. Genoese Admiral Lombardoria commanded 90 galleys against a Venetian fleet of nearly equal size. The battle raged for an entire day near the Dalmatian coast. When it ended, the Genoese had captured 68 Venetian galleys and 7,000 prisoners. Venice's Adriatic supremacy, seemingly unshakable for decades, had been challenged at its very foundation. But Genoa could not press its advantage. The captured galleys required crews. Maintaining forces far from home strained Genoese resources. Venice, fighting in its own waters with short supply lines, rebuilt its fleet within months. The war continued for another year before exhaustion forced both sides to negotiate peace in 1300. The truce lasted barely 70 years. In 1378, conflict reignited with unprecedented ferocity. The War of Chioggia would determine Mediterranean supremacy once and for all. Genoa formed an alliance with Hungary and Padua, cities that had their own grievances against Venetian expansion. The combined forces planned something no foreign power had attempted in 500 years. They would invade the Venetian lagoon itself and destroy the republic at its heart. The Genoese fleet, commanded by Admiral Pietro Doria, swept through Venetian defenses with terrifying efficiency. They captured Chioggia, the fortified town at the southern entrance to the lagoon, barely 15 miles from Venice proper. For the first time since the city's founding, enemy forces occupied Venetian home waters. Genoa's galleys patrolled the channels between the barrier islands. The blockade was complete. Venice faced annihilation. Genoa's commanders believed the Republic would surrender within weeks. Food supplies dwindled. Trade ceased entirely. The psychological impact was profound. Venetians had always believed their lagoon made them untouchable. Now enemy troops occupied Chioggia, visible from Venetian bell towers. But Doria had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed controlling Chioggia meant controlling the lagoon. He did not understand that the shallow, shifting channels required intimate local knowledge. Venetian pilots knew every sandbar, every current, every navigable passage. The Genos found themselves trapped in an unfamiliar maze. Venice appointed Admiral Vetter Pisani to command the counteroffensive. Rather than attacking Chioggia directly, Pisani blockaded the town from the sea, using hulks filled with stones to seal the channels. The besiegers became the besieged. Genoa's forces in Chioggia could not escape, could not be reinforced, could not be supplied. The siege lasted 6 months. Genoa's troops ate horses, then rats, then leather. Disease ravaged the trapped garrison. In June of 1380, the Genoese commander surrendered. 4,000 prisoners marched into Venetian captivity. The greatest threat to Venice's existence had been crushed not through superior numbers, but through superior knowledge of home waters. The Peace of Turin in 1381 formally ended the war. Both republics were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their fleets damaged. But Venice had survived. The survival of Venice against Genoa raised a profound question. How had this republic, constantly at war, never succumbed to the tyranny that plagued every other Italian city? Milan fell to the Visconti. Florence battled the Medici for control. Genoa itself cycled through dictators and foreign overlords. Yet Venice remained stable, governed by its nobles through institutions that checked ambition and distributed power with mathematical precision. The answer lay in a revolution that had transformed Venetian politics 90 years before the War of Chioggia. In 1297, the Great Council enacted the Serrata, the closing. This decree fundamentally altered who could participate in government. Previously, the Great Council had been theoretically open to any successful merchant or craftsman. The Serrata restricted membership to families already enrolled or those who could prove their ancestors had served in the council. Approximately 200 families now comprised a hereditary ruling class. The door to political power slammed shut. This sounds like tyranny. In practice, it created something more complex, a collective oligarchy where no single family could dominate. Every patrician family held a stake in stability. Revolution meant risking everything. Unity became survival. But how did Venice prevent ambitious nobles from seizing control? The answer emerged in the elaborate election of the doge himself. The procedure, refined over centuries, resembled a mechanical device designed to thwart conspiracy. The Great Council first selected 30 members by lot. These 30 drew lots again, reducing themselves to 9. The 9 nominated 40 candidates. The 40 drew lots to become 12. The 12 nominated 25. The 25 drew lots to become 9. The 9 nominated 45. The 45 became 11 by lot. The 11 nominated 41. These 41 finally elected the doge. The process took days. Each stage inserted randomness that made predetermined outcomes impossible. A noble could scheme and bribe, but he could not control the lottery. The system assumed men were ambitious and designed itself around that assumption rather than trusting in virtue. The doge, once elected, found his power carefully circumscribed. He could not meet foreign ambassadors alone. He could not open official correspondence privately. He could not leave Venice without permission. He wore magnificent robes and lived in a palace, but 6 counselors shadowed his every decision. The crown was golden. The cage was real. Venice created additional bodies to balance power further. The Senate, comprising roughly 300 members, controlled foreign policy and trade regulations. The Great Council, swelling to over 1,000 nobles, served as the ultimate legislative authority. And in 1310, following a conspiracy that threatened the state, Venice established its most feared institution, the Council of Ten. The 10 were elected annually to investigate threats to the Republic. They operated in secret, met at night, and could arrest anyone, including doges and senators. They commanded their own spies, their own budget, their own armed forces. Venetians whispered about the Bocca di Leone, the lion's mouths, marble slots carved into walls throughout the city where anonymous accusations could be deposited. The Council of Ten read every denunciation. This might have devolved into terror. Instead, the 10 became Venice's greatest stabilizer. Nobles knew that plotting meant destruction. The consequences were certain and swift. Executed conspirators disappeared into the lagoon. Their families lost everything. The system punished ambition that threatened collective rule while rewarding ambition that served the state through trade and warfare. The result was unprecedented. A government that lasted over 1,000 years without revolution, without civil war, without collapse. Other cities marveled at Venetian stability. They could not replicate it. The system required acceptance of collective power over individual glory, something that contradicted every instinct of medieval nobility. The 15th century opened with Venice in an enviable position. The war with Genoa was won. Trade routes stretched from London to Beirut. But the spoils of maritime dominance now manifested in something unexpected. A transformation of the city itself from functional trading post into a vision of earthly paradise. Merchant wealth poured into construction at a scale that dwarfed anything Venice had attempted before. Along the Grand Canal, patrician families competed to build palaces that would announce their status for generations. The Cadoro, commissioned by the Contarini family in 1421, rose like a jeweled casket. Its facade featured delicate Gothic tracery picked out in gold leaf and ultramarine, creating a shimmering screen that caught the canal's reflected light. Nearby, the Foscari family constructed a palace so massive it required driving thousands of timber piles deep into the lagoon bed to support its marble weight. These were not fortresses. Venice needed no defensive walls within the lagoon. Instead, patricians built for beauty and display. The Gothic style they adopted, borrowed from Northern Europe but transformed by Venetian sensibilities, emphasized lightness and repetition. Pointed arches marched across facades in rhythmic arcades. Stone carved into lace patterns that seemed impossibly fragile. The buildings appeared to float, as if the very substance of marble had dissolved into ornament. But even as Venice perfected itself on the water, the Republic made a fateful decision that would alter its character forever. In 1405, the city conquered Padua. By 1420, Venetian territory stretched west to include Verona, Brescia, and Bergamo. For the first time in its history, Venice was a land power. The expansion brought wealth. Mainland cities paid taxes, supplied grain during shortages, and provided soldiers for Venice's armies. Control of Alpine passes meant regulating trade between Germany and Italy. Yet this success carried profound risks. Venice now competed directly with Milan and Florence for Italian territory, entangling itself in the peninsula's endless wars. The city's attention, once focused solely on the sea, now split between protecting trade routes in the east and defending borders in Lombardy. Meanwhile, something remarkable emerged from the workshops clustered around the Rialto. Venetian artists, funded by merchant patrons flush with ducats, began painting in a style that would revolutionize European art. Gentile Bellini and his younger brother Giovanni transformed religious subjects through an innovation that seemed simple but changed everything. They painted light itself. Venice had always been about light. Dawn breaking over the lagoon, sunset gilding domes, reflections fragmenting across water. The Bellini brothers captured this luminosity on wooden panels using oil paints mixed with unprecedented care. Their Madonnas seemed to glow from within. Their saints stood in spaces that breathed air and depth. They portrayed Venice itself in processional scenes where the city's architecture and citizens became subjects worthy of devotion. Giovanni Bellini's altarpieces in particular demonstrated a new way of seeing. In his San Giobbe altarpiece, completed around 1480, the Virgin and Child inhabit a barrel-vaulted space that extends the actual architecture of the church. Heaven and Venice merged into a single, coherent reality. This was the early Renaissance arriving in Venice, but with distinct Venetian characteristics. While Florentine artists emphasized line and intellectual rigor, Venetians remained seduced by color, atmosphere, and sensory pleasure. Their paintings celebrated the material world with an intensity that matched their commercial appetites. The 15th century, then, saw Venice complete. Maritime empire, territorial state, artistic center. The Republic had achieved everything its founders might have imagined. But across the Mediterranean, forces were gathering that would test whether Venice's perfection could survive the coming storm. On the morning of May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old and consumed by visions of empire, breached the walls that had protected Christendom's eastern capital for 1,000 years. The city that Venice had plundered during the Fourth Crusade now belonged to an Islamic empire that controlled both sides of the Bosphorus. Venice received the news with calculated pragmatism. The doge dispatched ambassadors immediately. They arrived in Constantinople bearing gifts and congratulations, negotiating for continued trading privileges in what the Ottomans now called Istanbul. Venice needed access to Black Sea grain and Eastern spices more than it needed Christian solidarity. The Sultan, recognizing Venice's commercial value, granted the Republic its fondaco and trading quarter. Business would continue. But this accommodation masked a darker reality. The Ottoman Empire was not static. It expanded with methodical ferocity, systematically absorbing the territories where Venetian merchants had operated for centuries. Albania fell. Serbian lands were conquered. Year by year, the Turkish frontier crept closer to Venetian possessions. Then came Negroponte. This island fortress in the Aegean, held by Venice since 1210, guarded the approaches to Constantinople and controlled vital shipping lanes. The Venetians considered it impregnable. They were catastrophically wrong. In June 1470, Mehmed arrived with a fleet of 300 ships and 70,000 men. The Venetian garrison numbered barely 2,000. For weeks they held, hoping relief would arrive from Venice. It did not. On July 12, Turkish forces breached the walls. What followed shocked Europe. Mehmed ordered the Venetian commander, Paolo Erizo, sawed in half alive. The garrison was slaughtered. Civilians were enslaved. News reached Venice in August. The Great Council convened in crisis. Senators who had grown rich on Eastern trade now confronted an existential question. Could Venice survive against an enemy with seemingly limitless resources? The Ottoman Empire fielded armies larger than Venice's entire population. Its navy, once negligible, now challenged Venetian galleys in their own waters. Venice responded as it always had, with money and calculation. The Republic hired condottieri, mercenary captains, to defend its Adriatic territories. It reinforced garrisons on Crete and Cyprus. New galleys slid down the arsenal's ramps at accelerated rates. But defense was ruinously expensive. The salt monopoly, customs revenues, forced loans from patricians. All were mobilized to fund a military establishment Venice had never needed when trade alone ensured security. The Turks understood Venice's vulnerabilities perfectly. They did not need to conquer the lagoon itself. They needed merely to strangle Venetian commerce. Ottoman fleets harassed merchant convoys. Pirates operating from Turkish ports attacked Venetian shipping with impunity. The spice trade, once a Venetian monopoly, became a gauntlet where every voyage risked capture. By 1479, Venice sued for peace. The treaty cost the Republic Negroponte, additional Aegean islands, and a massive indemnity payment of 100,000 ducats. Venice retained its trading privileges, but on Ottoman terms. The balance had shifted irrevocably. In the Doge's palace, patricians faced uncomfortable truths. For 4 centuries, Venice had dominated the Mediterranean through naval superiority and commercial cunning. Now an empire commanded by warrior sultans possessed both the military force and economic sophistication to challenge Venice on every front. The question was no longer whether Venice could expand its empire, but whether it could preserve what remained. And far to the west, Portuguese ships were attempting something that would make the Turkish threat seem almost manageable. They were searching for a sea route to India that bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. In 1498, a Portuguese fleet under Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed directly to Calicut on India's western coast. The ships that limped back to Lisbon 13 months later carried a cargo that changed everything. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger purchased directly from Indian merchants, without a single Venetian intermediary. Venice had built its fortune on a simple geographic fact. Spices from Asia had to pass through Middle Eastern ports before reaching Europe. Venetian merchants bought from Arab and Turkish traders in Alexandria, Beirut, and Constantinople, then sold at enormous markup to European buyers. The Republic controlled both ends of this transaction through superior naval power and centuries of accumulated commercial relationships. Portuguese ships sailing around Africa threatened to erase this entire system. The numbers were devastating. A pound of pepper that cost 1 ducat in Calicut sold for 80 ducats in Venice after passing through multiple middlemen. Da Gama's voyage proved that Portuguese ships could buy that same pepper for 1 ducat and sell it in Lisbon for 20, undercutting Venetian prices while generating fantastic profits. Geography, which had blessed Venice for a millennium, now became its curse. Initially, Venetian senators dismissed the Portuguese achievement. The voyage had taken 2 years. Storms and scurvy had killed half da Gama's crew. Surely such losses made the route commercially impractical. But the Portuguese persisted. Pedro Álvares Cabral sailed in 1500 with 13 ships. Francisco de Almeida followed in 1505 with 22. Each fleet grew larger, more confident, more profitable. Spice prices in Venice began their inexorable collapse. Merchants who had paid premium rates for pepper and cinnamon from Alexandria suddenly found Portuguese spices flooding European markets at half the cost. Venetian galleys returned from the Levant with cargoes that no longer commanded the prices that had funded the Republic's expansion. The Senate convened emergency sessions. Could Venice compete on the ocean route? The Republic's galleys, perfected for Mediterranean conditions, were unsuited for Atlantic storms. Venetian navigation expertise meant nothing in waters no Venetian had sailed. Even if Venice developed ocean-going vessels, Portuguese forts now dotted the African coast and Indian Ocean, backed by royal monopolies that prohibited competition. Desperate diplomatic efforts began. Venice sent envoys to Cairo, urging the Mamluk Sultan to block Portuguese access to the Red Sea. Joint Venetian Mamluk fleets attempted to engage Portuguese warships near India. All failed catastrophically. Portuguese cannon technology, developed specifically for naval warfare, shattered the lightly armed galleys of Venice's allies. At the Battle of Diu in 1509, a Portuguese fleet of 18 ships destroyed a combined Mamluk Egyptian-Venetian force 3 times its size. The Venetian ambassador to Portugal, Leonardo de Chalmacer, sent increasingly alarmed reports. Portuguese merchants, he wrote, were systematically establishing trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean. They negotiated directly with Hindu princes and Muslim merchants who had once sold exclusively to Venetian middlemen. Most ominously, Portugal's King Manuel claimed divine authority for this enterprise, styling himself Lord of the Conquest, navigation and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. This was not mere trade. It was imperial expansion backed by religious fervor. By 1510, the transformation was undeniable. Spice arrivals in Venice had declined by half. The fondaci that Venetian merchants maintained in eastern Mediterranean ports sat partially empty. Young patricians who would once have commanded spice galleys to Alexandria now found their career prospects dimming. The Republic that had survived plague, crusades, and Ottoman conquest now confronted something more insidious than any army: technological and geographic obsolescence. Venetian power had always rested on controlling the junction between East and West. But what happened when ships could simply sail around that junction entirely? In the doge's palace, patricians who prided themselves on calculated pragmatism faced a problem that money and diplomacy could not solve. The world was becoming larger, and Venice's position in it was shrinking. Perhaps salvation lay not in distant oceans, but closer to home in territories Venice had long neglected, the Italian mainland itself. How does a city that ruled the waves for centuries face its greatest threat not from the sea, but from jealous neighbors? In 1508, every major power in Europe united with a single purpose: the destruction of Venice. Pope Julius II crafted the diplomatic weapon. His grievances were specific. Venice controlled Romagna and portions of the Papal States that Rome claimed by ancient right. But Julius understood that envy, not principle, would forge his alliance. France coveted Venetian territories in Lombardy. Spain wanted ports on the Adriatic coast. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian desired lands Venice had seized in Friuli and Istria. Even Hungary joined, seeking Dalmatian cities across the water. The League of Cambrai, signed in December 1508, was extraordinary in its scope. Never before had Pope, Emperor, and kings coordinated so completely against a single target. The agreement specified exactly which territories each power would claim from Venice's mainland empire. They would divide the terra firma like butchers portioning a carcass. Venice faced this coalition with approximately 20,000 troops. France alone could field 40,000. The Republic's famous navy meant nothing in this conflict. Galleys could not defend alpine passes or fortified cities in the Po Valley. For the first time in living memory, Venice would fight primarily on land against enemies who vastly outnumbered her. The armies met at Agnadello on May 14, 1509. Venetian forces under Bartolomeo d'Alviano and Niccolò di Pitigliano faced the French vanguard south of the Adda River. What followed was catastrophe. French artillery, the finest in Europe, shattered Venetian infantry formations. Cavalry charges broke the Republic's mercenary companies. By evening, 4,000 Venetian soldiers lay dead. D'Alviano himself was captured, paraded before the French king like a prize animal. Cities fell with astonishing speed. Bergamo, Brescia, Cremona all opened their gates to French troops within weeks. Populations that Venice had governed for decades welcomed new masters with apparent relief. The mainland empire that Venice had spent a century building dissolved in less than a month. In the Doge's palace, senators confronted potential extinction. League armies now stood just miles from the lagoon itself. No defensive walls protected Venice's scattered islands. If enemies built bridges across the shallows, the city itself could fall. Some patricians advocated immediate surrender. Others proposed abandoning the mainland entirely, retreating to Venice's maritime possessions in the eastern Mediterranean. But Doge Leonardo Loredan recognized what the League's architects had overlooked: coalitions built on greed fracture easily. Pope Julius wanted Venice humbled, not destroyed. A completely ruined Venice served no one's interests. The Republic still controlled Mediterranean trade routes that all Europe needed. And most importantly, France was becoming dangerously powerful in northern Italy. The same jealousy that created the League could be turned against its members. Venetian diplomats deployed their deadliest weapons: gold and whispered promises. Julius received assurances that Venice would return papal territories and acknowledge Rome's spiritual supremacy. The Pope, alarmed by French ambitions, began reconsidering his alliance. By February 1510, Julius had absolved Venice of interdict and begun secret negotiations. The reversal was stunning. Within 18 months, the Pope who had engineered Venice's destruction now sought Venetian support against France. The League of Cambrai splintered into competing factions. Spain quarreled with France over division of spoils. Maximilian, perpetually impoverished, proved more interested in Venetian subsidies than Venetian territory. Venice would not recover all its mainland possessions, not yet. But the Republic had survived what should have been annihilation. As Venetian galleys resumed their trading routes and Senate sessions continued in their ancient rhythms, one lesson emerged clearly. In a world of shifting alliances, survival belonged not to the strongest but to the most adaptable. The summons arrived in Venice during the autumn of 1570. Pope Pius V proposed a holy alliance against Sultan Selim II, whose fleets now dominated the eastern Mediterranean. For Venice, the decision was agonizing. The Republic had maintained profitable, if uneasy, commercial relations with the Ottomans for decades. War meant sacrificing trading privileges that generated enormous wealth. But Ottoman aggression left little choice. Selim had seized Cyprus in 1570, one of Venice's last major colonial possessions. Venetian garrisons at Nicosia and Famagusta had resisted desperately. When Famagusta finally surrendered after a siege lasting nearly a year, Ottoman commander Lala Mustafa Pasha ordered the Venetian governor flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and paraded through Constantinople. The message was unmistakable: submit or face annihilation. The Holy League formed in May 1571. Pope Pius provided moral authority and funding. Spain contributed the largest contingent of ships and soldiers under Don Juan of Austria, King Philip II's half-brother. Venice supplied galleys, experienced crews, and intimate knowledge of Ottoman tactics. Genoa, Venice's ancient rival, sent vessels commanded by the renowned Admiral Gianandrea Doria. Malta's Knights of St. John joined with their battle-hardened warriors. The combined fleet assembled at Messina in late summer, over 200 galleys carrying approximately 30,000 soldiers and 12,000 sailors. Ottoman intelligence reported the gathering storm, but Sultan Selim's commanders underestimated Christian unity. Ali Pasha led nearly 300 Ottoman galleys from their base at Lepanto on the Gulf of Corinth, confident that Christian divisions would splinter their alliance as always. The fleets met on October 7th, 1571. Morning mist lifted to reveal both armadas arrayed across miles of open water. Ottoman galleys formed a massive crescent, attempting to envelop Christian flanks through their numerical advantage. Don Juan anchored his center with 6 massive galleasses, floating fortresses mounting heavy artillery that Ottoman vessels lacked. The battle began with artillery exchanges that shredded wooden hulls and human bodies with equal efficiency. Then galleys rammed into one another, transforming naval combat into desperate boarding actions. Venetian crews, fighting for their republic's survival, showed particular ferocity. Ottoman janissaries, elite infantry who had never known defeat on land, discovered that galley decks offered no room for tactical maneuver, only brutal close-quarter slaughter. Don Juan's flagship locked with Ali Pasha's vessel in the battle center. Spanish arquebusiers poured fire into Ottoman ranks. When soldiers finally boarded, the Turkish commander fell with a bullet through his forehead. His severed head was hoisted on a pike, spreading panic through Ottoman lines. By afternoon, the scale of destruction was staggering. Over 200 Ottoman galleys had been captured or sunk. 15,000 Ottoman sailors and soldiers lay dead. Thousands more, including Christian slaves chained to Ottoman oars, gained their freedom. Christian losses, though severe at 8,000 dead, paled beside Ottoman catastrophe. Europe celebrated Lepanto as Christianity's greatest victory over Islam since the Crusades. Bells rang from Rome to Madrid. Artists immortalized the battle in paintings and poems. The Ottoman fleet, seemingly invincible, had been annihilated. Yet strategic reality proved disappointing. The Holy League failed to capitalize on victory. Spain's attention shifted to Atlantic concerns. Venice, exhausted financially, sued for peace with Constantinople. Within 2 years, the Ottoman fleet had been rebuilt. Cyprus remained in Turkish hands. Lepanto demonstrated that Ottoman power could be challenged. But it also revealed that Mediterranean dominance now required resources beyond any single city's capacity. Venice had won its last great naval battle. The question facing the Republic was whether naval glory still mattered. The victory at Lepanto purchased Venice breathing room, not deliverance. While the Republic celebrated, fundamental shifts in global commerce were rendering Mediterranean dominance increasingly irrelevant. The future of European wealth lay not in the Adriatic or Aegean, but in the vast Atlantic Ocean where Venice possessed neither presence nor influence. Dutch and English merchants pioneered revolutionary approaches to maritime trade. Amsterdam established the Dutch East India Company in 1602, creating the world's first publicly traded corporation. Investors purchased shares, distributing risk across hundreds of participants rather than depending on individual merchant families. The company's massive capital reserves financed fleets that dwarfed anything Venice could assemble. English merchants followed suit, chartering their own joint stock companies that combined royal backing with private investment. These northern competitors possessed another advantage: direct Atlantic access. Their vessels sailed to Asia via the Cape of Good Hope, bypassing Mediterranean middlemen entirely. Spices that once enriched Venetian warehouses now flowed through Amsterdam and London at prices Venice could not match. The ancient overland routes through the Levant, which had sustained Venice for centuries, became commercial backwaters. The Ottomans, meanwhile, refused to grant Venice peace on favorable terms. The final settlement in 1573 forced the Republic to surrender Cyprus permanently and pay 300,000 ducats in tribute. Venice retained scattered Mediterranean outposts, but the era of expansive colonial empire had ended. Crete remained Venetian, along with several Adriatic ports, yet these possessions consumed resources without generating commensurate profits. Venetian leadership, recognizing that maritime commerce was slipping from their grasp, pivoted toward manufacturing and banking. The Republic's famous glass industry expanded production, creating luxury items for European nobility. Venetian workshops pioneered new techniques in textile production, particularly silk weaving and lace making. The arsenal, once dedicated solely to warship construction, diversified into commercial shipbuilding and weapons manufacturing. Banking became Venice's salvation. Centuries of commercial expertise had created sophisticated financial institutions. Venetian banks financed trade ventures across Europe, charging interest and fees that generated steady income. The Republic's reputation for stability attracted deposits from foreign merchants who trusted Venetian banks more than their own kingdom's treasuries. Wealthy families like the Corners and Contarinis transformed themselves from merchant princes into international bankers. Yet this transformation came with loss. Manufacturing and banking generated wealth, but not the swaggering confidence of maritime empire. Young Venetians no longer dreamed of commanding merchant fleets to exotic ports. The arsenal employed fewer workers each decade. Shipyards that once thundered with construction now stood quiet for months. Still, Venice remained breathtakingly wealthy. Visitors marveled at the city's opulence even as its political power waned. Palaces lined the Grand Canal. Churches displayed Titian and Tintoretto masterpieces. During Carnival, nobles wore masks costing more than common families earned in years. The Republic had discovered an uncomfortable truth. Wealth could persist even as dominance faded. Venice no longer commanded Mediterranean commerce, but Venetian bankers financed those who did. The 18th century found Venice playing an unexpected new role. Europe's most fashionable destination for pleasure seekers. Unable to compete in global commerce, the Republic transformed itself into something unprecedented, a city dedicated entirely to entertainment and indulgence. Carnival, once a brief pre-Lenten celebration, expanded to consume half the year. From October through Lent, and again in spring, Venice became a masked city where social conventions dissolved. Nobles and commoners alike donned the botta, a white mask paired with black cape and tricorn hat, creating perfect anonymity. Behind these disguises, Europe's aristocracy gambled, flirted, and indulged desires impossible in their rigidly structured home countries. The gambling parlors operated openly, generating substantial tax revenue for the Republic. The Rialto, Europe's first public casino, occupied rooms in the Palazzo Dandolo near San Marco. Here, fortunes changed hands nightly at faro and Beccetta tables. Young aristocrats from across Europe squandered inheritances in single evenings while masked Venetian courtesans circulated through the crowds, available for companionship at appropriate fees. Opera houses proliferated across the city. Teatro La Fenice, Teatro San Benedetto, Teatro San Moise, each competed to present the most spectacular productions. Unlike austere northern theaters, Venetian opera houses featured private boxes where wealthy patrons conducted social calls, negotiated business deals, and entertained lovers while singers performed below. The music provided elegant background for Venice's real entertainment: conversation, seduction, intrigue. Giacomo Casanova embodied this Venice perfectly. Born in 1725 to an actress mother, he used intelligence, charm, and shameless audacity to infiltrate aristocratic circles across Europe. His memoirs chronicled a Venice where wit mattered more than birth, where a clever commoner could dine with nobles, seduce their wives, and escape consequences through eloquent deception. Though authorities eventually imprisoned him in the Doge's palace leads for libertine behavior, his daring escape only enhanced his legend. Venice became the essential destination for young aristocrats completing their grand tour. After viewing Roman antiquities and Florentine art, wealthy young men arrived in Venice for education of a different sort. The city offered sophisticated courtesans who combined beauty with genuine intellectual cultivation. These women hosted salons discussing philosophy and literature alongside providing more intimate instruction. Their presence attracted young tourists whose spending sustained Venice's economy. The Republic encouraged this transformation deliberately. Government authorities licensed courtesans, regulated gambling houses, and promoted theatrical productions. What other cities condemned as vice, Venice marketed as refined pleasure. Mask makers, costume designers, musicians, and servants all prospered from the endless stream of wealthy visitors seeking experiences unavailable elsewhere. Yet, beneath the glittering surface, something essential had vanished. The confident merchant republic that once challenged empires now depended on amusing, bored aristocrats. Venice had become magnificent, frivolous, and somehow melancholy, a fading beauty trading on past glory while masked revelers danced through its marble halls. The masquerade could not last forever. In April of 1796, a young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte led French revolutionary armies into Italy with stunning speed. Within weeks, his forces shattered Austrian armies that had dominated northern Italy for generations. Milan fell, then Mantua, then fortress after fortress across the Lombardy plain. Venice, neutral for centuries, watched with growing alarm as French armies approached its mainland territories. The Republic faced an impossible dilemma. Its fleet had deteriorated, its arsenals held outdated weapons, its army numbered barely a few thousand men. The merchant princes who once commanded galleys now commanded nothing more formidable than pleasure barges. Decades of carnival had left Venice prosperous in appearance but hollow in substance, incapable of defending the independence its ancestors had maintained for over a millennium. In April of 1797, French troops occupied Venetian territories on the mainland. The Republican government lodged formal protests, asserting neutrality rights that had protected Venice through previous conflicts. Napoleon ignored them. He understood that revolutionary France had no patience for aristocratic republics, however ancient their pedigree. Venice represented everything the revolution opposed: hereditary privilege, old regime luxury, a government answerable only to a closed circle of noble families. Then came the incident that sealed Venice's fate. On April 17th, French sailors attempting to enter Venice's harbor came under fire from nervous Venetian gunners at the Lido fortress. Several Frenchmen died in the exchange. Napoleon, whether genuinely outraged or seizing a convenient excuse, declared Venice guilty of aggression against France. His ultimatum arrived swiftly: accept a democratic government under French supervision or face military destruction. The Great Council convened on May 12, 1797, for the final time in its 1,000-year history. 120 members gathered in the Doge's palace chamber where generations of their ancestors had deliberated. Outside, French armies waited across the lagoon while pro-French agitators stirred unrest in the city streets. Ludovico Manin, the 120th and last Doge of Venice, presided over the debate. Elected in 1789, he had spent his reign watching helplessly as European wars closed around the Republic. Now he faced the ultimate question: should Venice fight, knowing defeat was certain, or surrender its independence without resistance? The vote came quickly. 512 councillors voted to accept Napoleon's terms. Only 20 opposed surrender, though many more simply stayed away, unable to bear witness to their republic's end. Manin removed his ducal crown and corno, the distinctive horn-shaped cap worn by every doge since Enrico Dandolo. "Take this," he told his valet, his voice heavy with resignation. "I shall not be needing it again." French troops entered Venice on May 16th. What followed was systematic plunder. Napoleon's commissioners seized the 4 bronze horses from San Marco, sending them to Paris along with paintings by Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. The treasury's gold went to fund French military campaigns. Ancient manuscripts from Venetian libraries were crated and shipped north. The winged lion of St. Mark, Venice's symbol for centuries, was torn from public buildings across the city. The republic that had outlasted the Roman Empire, survived the Black Death, and defeated the Ottoman Sultan at Lepanto ended not with dramatic resistance, but with quiet capitulation. The masked revelers who had danced through Venice's final decades discovered that pleasure was poor preparation for the moment when history's judgment finally arrived. Venice's new masters changed with bewildering speed. Napoleon's occupation lasted barely 18 months before he traded the city to Austria in the Treaty of Campo Formio, exchanging Venice like a bargaining chip for Austrian recognition of French control in Belgium. The Austrians arrived in January of 1798, and Venetians discovered that being reduced from sovereign republic to provincial possession brought profound humiliation. Austrian bureaucrats reorganized Venice's administration along imperial lines, imposing German alongside Italian as an official language. The arsenal, once the beating heart of naval construction, became a storage facility for Austrian military equipment. Palace ballrooms where doges had received ambassadors now hosted Habsburg officials who viewed Venice as merely another possession in their sprawling empire, less important than Vienna, Milan, or Prague. Yet Venice would not accept subjugation quietly. In March of 1848, as revolution swept across Europe, a Venetian lawyer named Daniel Manin led an uprising against Austrian rule. For 17 months, the restored Venetian Republic held out against Austrian siege, enduring bombardment and blockade. Citizens melted church bells for cannon metal. Women donated jewelry to fund resistance. When food supplies dwindled, Venetians ate cats, dogs, finally rats rather than surrender. But romantic defiance could not overcome modern military power. Cholera ravaged the besieged city. Austrian artillery pounded buildings that had stood for centuries. By August of 1849, starvation forced capitulation. Manin fled into exile, his dream of restored independence crushed, and Austrian rule returned with vengeful determination. The Austrians held Venice until 1866, when newly unified Italy, allied with Prussia in war against Austria, finally brought Venice into the Italian kingdom. After 7 decades as a subjugated prize passed between empires, Venice rejoined Italian governance through plebiscite in October. The vote was nearly unanimous. 646,000 Venetians chose Italian unification, just 69 opposed. Yet independence was gone forever. Venice became one city among many in the new Italian state. No longer a sovereign power, but a provincial capital, beautiful but diminished, living increasingly off memories rather than maritime commerce. Something unexpected began filling Venice's empty palaces and silent squares. Tourists arrived in growing numbers, drawn by romantic literature celebrating Venice's faded grandeur. Lord Byron's poetry, John Ruskin's architectural writings, and countless paintings depicted Venice as a melancholy masterpiece, a city frozen in aristocratic twilight. Hotels opened in former palazzos. Gondolas that once carried merchants now ferried visitors seeking picturesque decay. The railway bridge completed in 1846 connected Venice permanently to the mainland, ending its 1,000-year island isolation. Steam trains brought visitors by the thousands, then tens of thousands. Venice discovered a new economy built not on trade or naval power, but on its own carefully preserved past. The city that had conquered an empire now learned to market its memories, transforming from republic to museum, from maritime power to tourist destination, from maker of history to monument preserving it. What endures from 1,000 years of maritime dominance? Venice's fingerprints mark the modern world in ways both visible and hidden, from the architecture of coastal cities to the very mechanisms of international finance. The Rialto district pioneered techniques that remain foundations of modern banking. Bills of exchange, allowing merchants to transfer funds across distances without moving physical gold, evolved in Venetian counting houses during the 13th century. Double entry bookkeeping, systematically recording debits and credits, became standardized practice among Venetian merchants before spreading across Europe. Marine insurance, enabling traders to share the risks of maritime commerce, developed in Venice's coffeehouses where ship owners and investors negotiated policies that protected cargoes against storm, piracy, and war. These innovations survived Venice's political collapse because they solved fundamental problems of global trade. When London became the world's financial center, when New York claimed that mantle, they built upon systems Venetian merchants had refined across centuries of Mediterranean commerce. Venice's architectural legacy proves equally persistent. The pointed arches and ornate facades of Venetian Gothic influenced building styles from Budapest to Beirut. Cities seeking to project maritime power consciously imitated Venetian models. Amsterdam's canal houses echo Venetian palazzos. Dubrovnik's fortifications replicate Venetian defensive designs. Even distant Mumbai bears Venetian architectural influence, its colonial buildings incorporating elements transported across empires by architects who studied Venice as the ideal of Mediterranean grandeur. The paintings of Bellini, Titian, and Tintoretto established techniques of color, light, and composition that shaped European art for centuries. Their mastery of oil painting, their understanding of perspective, their ability to capture texture and atmosphere influenced everyone from Rubens to Rembrandt. The Venetian school taught Europe how light could be painted, how color could convey emotion, how canvas could capture the interplay of water, architecture, and human drama. Yet modern Venice faces challenges its doggall predecessors never imagined. The Acqua Alta, the regular flooding that turns squares into shallow lakes, grows worse each decade. Climate change raises sea levels. The subsidence caused by groundwater extraction during the 20th century left city lower in the water. The massive flood barriers of the Mose project, completed after decades of construction and controversy, deployed during exceptional tides, but cannot solve Venice's fundamental vulnerability. Tourism, the industry that saved Venice's economy, now threatens to overwhelm it. Before the global pandemic of 2020 temporarily suspended mass tourism, over 25 million visitors annually crowded streets built for perhaps 70,000 residents. The permanent population continues declining, falling below 50,000 as rising costs and tourist disruption drive Venetians to mainland suburbs. The question Venice poses to history is whether a civilization can survive success. The Republic endured 1,000 years through adaptation, innovation, and pragmatic flexibility. Its merchants mastered changing conditions. Its diplomats navigated shifting alliances. Its shipwrights revolutionized naval technology. The city they built survives as testament to human ingenuity, maritime ambition, and the fragile triumph of civilization built upon unstable lagoon mud. Whether future generations preserve this legacy or watch it sink beneath rising waters remains the final chapter in Venice's long story. Venice's thousand-year empire proved that audacity and adaptation can overcome any obstacle, even geography itself. Subscribe to explore more stories of civilizations that defied the odds.